So this is the first video for the watercolor unit that we are starting. It's got wet on wet and wet on dry watercolor techniques, and I'll demonstrate those in a second. But first I need to do a shout out to Luis and Jaden. So this painting, I did it pretty quickly. It's small, so it didn't take very long. But it uses all the techniques we talked about. It uses wet on dry, and some color blending. So I'm going to demonstrate those techniques just on a separate paper, and then I'll revisit this painting at the end of the video and explain which techniques I used and where. Okay, we had for our essential question with watercolors, how do I get them to look how I plan? So if you have a picture in mind, you want the paint to behave kind of predictable, and there's two kind of main techniques of doing that: wet on wet painting and wet on dry painting. I'm going to start with wet on dry, which is simply taking wet paint and painting it on dry paper. It gives you nice crisp edges. You can see how the paint's staying exactly where I put it. It's also possible to do very small details with it. Even with a big brush like this, it has a pointed tip. Not all brushes do, but this one does. So I can actually take just the tip of this brush and do some very small details because my paper is dry. If I have my paper wet, the paint will behave a little bit differently. So I'm wetting this paper. This is going to be wet on wet. Wet paint on wet paper. Just painting a water spot, and then I'm going to put wet paint on that water. And you can see that it behaves quite differently. It spreads out, which can be a really pretty effect if you want it, but sometimes if you're painting a picture and your paint in one spot's not dry, that can happen by accident and it can mess up what you wanted to happen. So you need to plan a lot when you're using watercolors and be patient. Let things dry before you paint next to them if you don't want them blurry. If I do that same skinny line on wet paper, it's gonna spread out. You can still see it a little bit, but it's fuzzy and spreaded. So one thing that can happen, like people sometimes get, one of the frustrations with watercolor is that they are so messy. So let's say you're painting, I'm going to do like a little bumblebee. So I paint my yellow. He's looking pretty cute. If I don't let this dry all the way before I paint the black stripes, what happens is you accidentally can mess up what your idea was. So that's accidental wet on wet painting. I'm gonna do wet on dry painting, but on paint. So I'm gonna paint this part, but I'm going to let it dry. So that can stay there until it's dry. But notice how there's two colors blended here. You can do this on purpose. And that's one of the nice things about wet on wet painting. When you do it on purpose, you can do some really neat effects. One of the things you can do is you can make a gradient from a dark color, and then if you just mix a little water and help it spread to a light color, you can get like a sort of an ombre effect. You can also do some color blending. So you can start with one color, and you can see it's already running across. If I add a second color, they'll start to blend, and I can actually help that happen by adding some water in the middle and letting them do their thing. You can also steer where you want the colors to go a little bit with your brush. It's not totally out of your control. Wet on wet blending kind of lets the colors do their own thing, but you do have a little bit of ability to steer the paint. So I'm gonna skip to where this is dry. Alright, so this yellow spot is now dry. And it's time to paint the stripes on it. So this one was wet, and you can see how now that the paint's dry, it's even more blurry. But I let this yellow dry first. Took about maybe 10 minutes. Now when I put my black lines on, they stay where I want them. They don't spread out. So wet on dry painting can be on top of another layer of paint, as long as that layer of paint is all the way dry. I can do little details now, like I can give the bee a little stinger. I can give it a face. I'm going to leave a little kind of shiny spot for where the eye is. I can give it legs. You know, it's a pretty cartoony looking little bee, but there you go. So that's wet on dry, even though it's on top of paint. Okay, so we looked at the different techniques. I showed you how to do them all, and then I used them all to make this. So when I did these trees, the trunks, I did these fine details with wet on dry, but you can see how there's a blend of colors on the trunks. After I painted wet paint for the brown, I added a little black paint on the edge. So I did wet on wet inside the area where I had already done wet on dry. The whole entire sky is all soft and cloudy looking. That's all wet on wet. I painted water across it, and then I did blue and black and a little bit of purple to get those kind of winter storm clouds. I did wet on dry for the larger trees, but once again, once I painted the brown and it was still wet, I painted a little black into it to get some shading on the trees. And same thing for these footprints. I painted them wet on dry so that they wouldn't run, but I put a little water on the edge to make them look like the snow was kind of soft. The leaves are wet on wet. I splatted some water down, and then I just put yellow and orange paint on the water. And at the top of this tree, you can see where, even though the blue was dry underneath, the yellow blended a little bit into the blue, which is fine because that's just another color of leaves that you can get. So you can work within the unpredictability of watercolors. If you understand them a little bit, you can kind of direct them and get them to turn out according to plan.